to Across the Fence. I'm Jolene Whitney. Today is the first day of classes at the University of Vermont. For new and returning students, it's a day filled with anticipation and anxiety. The same could be said for new teachers. But what if you're a bit further up the chain of command? A dean, let's say. Are the emotions similar? And what about the expectations? Our guest today is Peter Newman, the newly appointed dean of the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources. Peter started his new job in July, but this is not his first time at UVM or in Vermont. Welcome.
Thanks, Jolene. It's great to be here.
We're happy to have you. And as I just said, this isn't your first time in Vermont. You actually received your PhD from UVM in 2002.
Yeah.
So what did you study and what do you remember from your time?
Well, I do still remember it. That's gosh, you know, I think what I remember most was actually how I got here, which is I was a National Park Service Ranger. I was working in Yosemite. And
wow.
Yosemite is an amazing place. At the time, it had about 4 million people a year coming in and out of the park. And you know, places like that, like so many issues in the environment, are all about the balance of how do you deal with so many people in a small and pretty fragile place, and how do you manage all of those people to make sure that those places are protected in perpetuity. And so, you know, as a park ranger, you really begin to see what those impacts are and how important it is to manage the people in those places. One day I'm out on the trail and I meet this person. I'm checking his permit. He's from Burlington, Vermont, and I was talking to him, and turns out he's a professor at University of Vermont. And I'd kind of heard of him because I'd read some of his stuff before. And that conversation turned into a conversation related to the work he does as a professor. It was at the time the School of Natural Resources at University of Vermont. And we began to talk about the importance of doing science in parks like Yosemite, and talking about the work he was doing there on sabbatical. And that became a conversation about how, you know, he said, well, what do you think we should be doing? And I told him some ideas and, you know, what I wanted to do as a ranger. And he said, well, why don't you come back and do a PhD? And so a year later, I found myself starting a PhD, arriving. It was actually 25 years ago, probably this week. I was arriving in Burlington, Vermont.
Wow.
as a new graduate student. And what I remember are the things that still make it great today. The amazing faculty, the amazing staff, the incredible students. It's a tight-knit community. People really enjoy working together. They're passionate about solving environmental problems, and they're passionate about what they do. So it's a great place to be.
And what was your PhD in?
In natural resource management. And what I studied was those very things. In fact, I went back to Yosemite, and this is Bob Manning, and Bob and I did a bunch of studies in parks and wilderness, and in Yosemite in particular, looking to understand what are the different aspects of wilderness that are there that need to be protected and also should be included in their wilderness management plan. And so that ended up really starting a career on visitor capacity and visitor management in parks and protected areas.
All right, and tell me a little bit about the students that you have in the Rubenstein School. How many do you have, and what are some programs you want to highlight?
Yeah, so you know, it's just an amazing program. We have about 12 to 1,300 students, undergraduate students, and about 100 graduate students. They are, you know, I think the thing that I love about what we do there is its interdisciplinary approach to our core curriculum. You know, so students they are exposed to the social sciences and ecology and critical thinking and systems thinking and ecological economics and problem solving. And those are all interrelated toward the different majors we have. So we have wildlife and fisheries biology, environmental science, forestry, recreation, park and tourism, sustainability, ecology, and policy, and forestry. And you know, those 5 majors are super important and really make up so much of the fabric of environmental issues today.
And you touched on this already a little bit. Environmental science is really popular at UVM,
Yeah.
and a lot of those students are in the Rubenstein School. So what do you think sets apart UVM's curriculum from other schools studying the same thing?
You know, I think one of the things that I've always believed in is just hands-on learning. I mean, if you think about the number of research programs we have where students can get experience, you know, you look at our research vessel down on Lake Champlain, the Marcel Melisara, you know, that students can get out there and actually do work and look at the latest technology to really understand the science behind water quality and fisheries. We have students out in the forest, getting wet, getting tired, and doing the measurements and getting dirty out there. And I think getting your hands dirty is a big part of learning. And so, I think it's the experiential pieces that are important. I think what sets them apart is that, oftentimes in a lot of these colleges across the country and natural resources, there's departments that really separate students. Our students are all one student body within our college. And part of that is that we are, a multidisciplinary community. And so that's something that's really important to all the faculty and staff and students. And I think when you mix all of those folks together, you add in experiential education, you get them outside in a beautiful place like Vermont, there's really very few places that can compete.
And kind of speaking of which, earlier this year we had two students from the Rubenstein School, two undergrads, Vegas Rockefeller and Connor Moses, and they did a story that was written and produced by another Rubenstein student, Caleb May, who fortunately for us works part-time for Across the Fence. And Caleb's story highlighted an ongoing research project at a wildlife refuge in Brunswick, Vermont. How important do you think being able to get onto the field is, even for retention?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can hear it in their voices. I went and watched that story. I think that happened before I arrived, but someone told me about it, and it's a phenomenal story. I definitely encourage folks to go find it, because what you hear in Vegas and Connor is the passion that happens when you get outside and when you actually really begin to think about these issues from the standpoint of being a major part of them. Those are two students that work with two of our best faculty, Tony D'Amato in forestry and Alan Strong in wildlife and wildlife biology. When you see what they're doing, when you hear them talk about getting up at 3 in the morning and tromping through the forest and doing their bird counts, you hear the passion in their voice. They sound like veteran biologists, when they're out there. And so that's what does it. I feel like experiential education is you're getting thrown in the fire a bit. You apply the theory that you learn in the classroom, you apply it in the real world, and all of a sudden you're being tested on it, just by practicing that very thing. And what comes out of that it's the confidence that you hear in their voices. That's what you get from it, and that's what sets them apart. And I would say kudos to Caleb, who learned how to tell a great story and capture that passion, right? And I feel like, if you're out in the forest, as they were describing, in the middle of the rain, surrounded by mosquitoes, and you're still excited about what you're doing, you found your life's work. And so that's what experiential education does. You asked about retention. I think that's really important. I mean, I think in today's world of higher education, where enrollment is a driving force of something that I think is pressuring a lot of universities around the country, retention is and student success is not only a hallmark of University of Vermont, but it's super important. And there is a lot of research that looks at these high impact practices and saying, what are the practices in higher education that really lead to persistence and retention? And one of them is engaging, or there's a few of them. One of them is engaging with faculty. That's what this is doing. One of them is getting out and doing field work, internships, study abroad. These are experiential things. And so those kinds of things really do help drive our very high retention and persistence rates. It's because our students are doing these things on a regular basis. We're all about it, and we think it's really, really important.
And as we mentioned at the top of our program, you received a PhD from UVM, but a lot of master's and undergraduate students play kind of a big role in that research. So do UVM faculty rely on students to assist with the research process?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's something that's really important to all of us, all of the faculty and staff and students there. From an undergraduate perspective, I remember as a graduate student, I worked with undergraduate students who came with me both to Yosemite when I was doing my work there and other parks that I was working with Bob Manning in. And those students today, I actually bumped into one recently who was telling me how important that time was for him, to really find his confidence and to find and learn about the world and really see a different, see college from a different perspective. From the graduate standpoint, I always tell faculty that the most important decision they make is choosing their graduate students. And that's because their research programs are based on that research engine, working with great graduate students, working with that community to learn and to teach them as the next generation of scientists out there. It's super important. And that's something that I feel like is really important within our community, is really working together with graduate students to really produce the best research and world-class research that we can.
And what do you think makes Vermont a unique place to learn about environmental science?
Yeah, that's something that's important. That I was actually thinking about that. There's very few places that I think are like Vermont. There's this great Benton Mackay was the person behind the concept of the Appalachian Trail. He basically developed the concept of the Appalachian Trail and fought for it. And he said that great landscapes are part rural tissue, part wild tissue, and part urban tissue. And when you think about that, there's so much truth in that. When you think about the most popular places to live, and when you look at those lists in Outside Magazine, or here are the best places to live, they are that. They are part wild, part urban, part rural. And in Vermont's case, we have this amazing pastoral landscape and this working landscape, which is really important for Vermont, amidst this, these incredible mountains next to a lake with these thriving cities. And so that makes this place a great place to live. And now in terms of doing the work, the balance of these things is really challenging, right? Because we have to think about how does what we're doing on the landscape affect all of these natural spaces? How does urban planning and growth affect what we do here? These are very big issues in the state of Vermont, to really be thinking about how do we balance both all the people coming into Vermont, and it's popular because of those things, right? How do we manage the working landscape and maintain its pastoral and cultural heritage of the place? But then at the same time, how do we work with public lands, both federal and non-federal lands, to really think about how this whole watershed affects Lake Champlain? And so when we think about all those issues, those are the big issues of today, right? Thinking about water, carbon, biodiversity, land management, those are the big issues that we are faced with across the world. And so if we can really work on these things right here today, apply those things internationally, we're doing our job as a land-grant university.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us today. My thanks to the crew behind the scenes here at WCAX. I'm Jolie Whitney. Have a good one.